The water was still. Not peaceful still. Not the kind of still that makes you close your eyes and breathe slowly. This was the still of something dead, a gray, flat, unmoving sheet of water stretching across what used to be 63 acres of farmland in Harlan County, Kentucky. The kind of still that makes your chest ache because you can see, just barely, the ghost of what something used to be. A rusted mailbox poked out from the waterline like a gravestone. The peak of a collapsed barn roof broke the surface 6 yards in. And if you looked carefully, if you really looked, you could see the faint outline of row crops beneath the surface, the skeletal geometry of a life someone had planted and lost. Nobody drove out to look anymore. The county assessor had written the property off twice. 3 real estate agents had listed it, dropped the price, relisted it, and eventually stopped returning calls. The neighbors, what few remained on that stretch of Route 9, called it the drowned place. Children dared each other to wade to the mailbox and back. Nobody wanted it. Until the morning a rusted 1994 Buick LeSabre pulled slowly off the road and stopped. The engine ticked. A car door opened. And an 71-year-old woman named Cecilia Marsh stood at the water's edge and looked at the drowned place like she recognized it. Like she'd been here before. Like she had been waiting her whole life to come back. Cecilia had arrived in Harlan County 6 weeks earlier with 4 things: a single suitcase, a canvas bag of garden seeds, a cashier's check for $11,000, the entirety of her savings after selling her late husband's tools, and a grief so heavy it had permanently altered the way she carried herself. Slightly forward. Like she was always bracing for wind. Her husband, Robert, had died 14 months before. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, the way that particular disease tends to be. They'd been married 44 years. They had no children, a decision the world had never quite forgiven them for, as though their marriage needed external validation to count. They'd had each other. They'd had a small house in Lexington with a garden that Robert tended on weekends. They'd had enough. And then she didn't have any of it. The Lexington house sold to cover Robert's medical bills and the reverse mortgage they'd taken out 3 years prior, convinced by a financial advisor who was later investigated by the state bar. Cecilia had moved into her sister-in-law's spare bedroom for 7 months. Which was 7 months of casseroles she didn't ask for and gentle suggestions about assisted living options, delivered in the tone people use when they've already made a decision for you. She was 71. Not 81. Not 91. But grief does something to a person's posture, and posture is the thing people actually see. She left her sister-in-law's house on a Tuesday without much ceremony. Packed her suitcase, tucked the canvas seed bag under her arm, wrote a thank you note that she meant entirely, and drove. She didn't have a destination so much as a direction, south and east, away from Lexington, away from the suburb where she and Robert used to walk every morning. Away from the coffee shop where the barista had finally, after 14 months, stopped asking the usual for 2. She ended up in a rented room above a hardware store in a small Harlan County town called Belfry. $40 a week. Shared bathroom down the hall. A window that faced the parking lot of a Dollar General. It was not where she had imagined her 70s. She spent the first 2 weeks barely leaving the room. She read. She sorted through the seed packets in her canvas bag: tomatoes, pole beans, squash, a heritage variety of sweet corn that Robert had sourced from a seed library in Ohio. She'd brought them without thinking, the way you grab the things closest to what you loved. On the 3rd week, she started walking. Harlan County is one of those places that holds its beauty quietly, almost reluctantly: rolling hills darkened green in summer, coal country roads that wind and double back. Old homesteads sitting half swallowed by vegetation. Cecilia walked every morning, first just to the end of Main Street and back, then farther. Then much farther. It was on one of those walks that she saw the notice stapled to a telephone pole outside the county clerk's office. Tax lien property auction, Parcel 14C, Route 9, minimum bid, $1. She stopped and read it 3 times. $1. She tore the notice off the pole gently, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. That night she spread it flat on the small desk in her room and sat looking at it in the lamplight for a long time. She looked up the parcel. Found the property listing photos online, the flooded fields, the collapsed barn, the sunken fence rows. She read the notes in the county file: severe flood damage, 2019. Owner deceased, no heirs. Property deemed non-viable for agriculture. Repeated delinquency on tax payments. No remediation. Then she went to sleep. She woke up before dawn, and without fully deciding to, she put on her coat and drove out Route 9. And she stood at the waterline and looked at the drowned place. Something in her chest shifted. Not joy, not quite. Something more complicated. The feeling of recognizing a language you thought you'd forgotten. The auction was held in the county clerk's office, a beige room with fluorescent lighting and a folding table. Cecilia was the only bidder. The auctioneer, a young man named Travis who looked profoundly bored, confirmed twice that the minimum bid was $1 and that the property was sold as is, with all encumbrances, flood damage, and outstanding county remediation fees. The outstanding fees came to $1,847. She paid them with a portion of her cashier's check and signed her name on the deed with a pen borrowed from Travis, who watched her with an expression caught somewhere between pity and confused respect. "You know this land's been underwater for going on 4 years," he said. "Yes," Cecilia said. "Ain't much left of the structure." "I know." He leaned forward slightly. "What do you plan to do with it?" She looked at him for a moment. The honest answer was that she didn't entirely know. The honest answer was that she had stood at the waterline that morning and felt, for the first time since Robert's diagnosis, a sense of orientation, like a compass needle finally finding north. The honest answer was complicated and personal and not particularly suited to a beige room. "Garden," she said. Travis blinked. "You're going to garden it?" "Eventually," she said, and folded the deed into her coat pocket beside the original auction notice. She drove back to the property that same afternoon. Parked the Buick. Pulled on a pair of rubber boots she'd bought at the hardware store below her rented room. And walked in. The water was cold. Knee-deep at the road's edge, then shallower as the land rose slightly toward the middle of the property. The bottom was soft, silted mud that grabbed at her boots with each step. Things moved beneath the surface. Frogs, probably. Small fish. The flood had become its own ecosystem. She moved slowly across the submerged land, getting the shape of it. The flood wasn't uniform. The southeast corner was the deepest, 5, maybe 6 feet, but the northwest quadrant, closest to the tree line, had areas that were only a few inches deep, almost marshy rather than flooded. A ridge of higher ground ran diagonally across the middle of the property, maybe 18 inches above the waterline, covered in reed grass and volunteer sumac. And it was there, on that ridge of higher ground, that she found the barn. Not the collapsed one visible from the road, that was a machine shed, mostly caved in. This was something older. A tobacco barn, built into a shallow hillside, its back wall partly buried in earth, its front wall still standing though leaning considerably. The flood had risen around it but not through it, the earthen hillside behind it had created a kind of natural dam. Inside was dry. Or not dry, exactly, but not flooded. The earthen floor was soft and cold. The air smelled of old wood, old tobacco, old time. Light came through gaps in the siding in long diagonal shafts. Cecilia stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. Then she saw them. Along the back wall, stacked carefully and covered with oilcloth, were wooden crates. Maybe 30 of them. The oilcloth had kept the worst of the moisture out. She crossed to them and peeled back the covering on the nearest crate. Seeds. Hundreds of small paper envelopes, hand-labeled in careful pencil script. Vegetables she recognized and some she didn't. Corn varieties. Bean varieties. Something labeled only Mountain Tobacco, 1961. Heritage breeds, open-pollinated, non-hybrid, the kind of seeds that carried decades of selective cultivation inside them. Seeds that modern agriculture had largely abandoned. She stood very still for a long time. Then she sat down on one of the crates and pressed both hands to her mouth, and for the first time since Robert's funeral, she cried. Not sad crying. Not exactly. The kind of crying that happens when something lost comes back to you in a form you didn't expect. She had come to this county with a bag of seeds because they were what she had left of the life she'd loved. And here, in a half-buried barn on $1's worth of flooded land, someone had done the same thing. Someone had saved everything they could. What followed was not a montage. It was not a sequence of determined mornings leading neatly to visible progress. It was slow, physically grueling, often discouraging, and occasionally absurd, a 71-year-old woman in rubber boots, alone on 63 acres of flooded land. Trying to bring something back from the dead. The first problem was the water. Cecilia had no engineering background. She spent her career as a high school biology teacher, which gave her a useful understanding of hydrology in theory and absolutely no practical knowledge of how to drain 4 years of standing water from a Kentucky farm. She went to the county extension office and spoke with an agricultural agent named Dale, who was polite but visibly doubtful. You'd need to establish proper drainage channels, he said, spreading a map across his desk. Depending on the soil composition and the original drainage system, you might be able to redirect some of this. There's probably an old tile drainage network under there, it might just be blocked or collapsed. But honestly, Miss Marsh, this is a significant remediation project. Are you working with a contractor? She was not working with a contractor. She was working with herself, a second-hand spade, 2 books on farm drainage she'd ordered from an interlibrary loan, and the knowledge that she had roughly $9,000 left. She hired one person, a young man named Marcus, 22 years old, who lived down Route 9 and had recently been laid off from the mines. He showed up the first morning with a shovel and a suspicious expression and didn't say much. He was not enthusiastic about the project. He thought, she suspected, that she was losing her mind. But he needed the work, and she needed the labor, so they had that much. The first month was excavation and failure. They dug trenches by hand along the property's natural gradient, hoping to create channels that would allow the water to drain toward the creek at the property's eastern edge. The creek was technically there, you could see it on the map, but 4 years of flood had merged it with the rest of the water, its banks invisible, its channels silted beyond recognition. The first set of drainage trenches filled with mud and collapsed within a week. The second attempt held better but drained slowly, a trickle, not the flow she needed. Cecilia stood at the edge of her newest trench on a cold October morning and watched a single earthworm make its way across the surface of the mud, and thought about how long this was going to take. That evening she sat in her rented room and spread the seed envelopes across the desk. 47 varieties she'd inventoried so far. She tested germination rates on several, placing seeds between damp paper towels, checking them every day. Some were too old. But many were viable. Shockingly many. Good oilcloth and a dry space had preserved them far better than she'd expected. She started writing letters. To university agricultural departments. To seed library organizations. To the Seed Savers Exchange. To anyone she could think of who might be able to identify the varieties, assess their viability, and understand what she might actually have. Most letters went unanswered. 3 received polite, non-committal responses. 1, from an agricultural historian at the University of Kentucky named Dr. Patricia Osei, came back with a phone number and a message that said simply, "Please call me as soon as possible." That conversation lasted 2 hours. Dr. Osei told her that based on the descriptions Cecilia had sent, several of the varieties, particularly the corn and the bean seeds, might be regionally significant heirloom cultivars that were believed to have been lost. There had been, Dr. Osei explained, a tobacco farmer in Harlan County named Elias Broughton who had been known in agricultural circles in the 1970s and 80s for maintaining an extraordinary collection of Appalachian heritage seeds. He had died in 2018. His land had flooded the following year. Cecilia sat down on the edge of her bed. Nobody went to look for the seeds, she asked. Dr. Osei was quiet for a moment. People didn't know where exactly they were kept. Elias didn't have family. The Extension Service made inquiries, but by the time the property situation was sorted out, the land was flooded and, nobody went. Well, Cecilia said. I went. But the seeds were only half the story. The other half was still 63 acres of water and mud and collapsed infrastructure. And that part wasn't moving as fast. By November, discouragement had a weight to it. Marcus had become more invested, something about the work had gotten into him. The physical honesty of it, but they were two people with shovels and a rented backhoe for 2 weeks and an impossible timeline. Cecilia's knees hurt. Her lower back ached in the evening with a constancy that made sleep difficult. She was burning through her savings faster than anticipated: fuel, materials, the rented room, food, the backhoe. One evening she did the math and realized she had about 5 months of runway left. She sat with that number for a while. Then she wrote in her journal, something she'd started doing on Robert's encouragement and had never stopped, a single line: I am not afraid of this. I am tired of this. Those are different things. She went to bed. She got up the next morning and drove back to the farm. The breakthrough, when it came, was not dramatic. It didn't announce itself with sunshine and swelling music. It came on a gray December morning when Marcus, digging near the property's southeast corner, struck something 3 feet down that rang against his spade with a hollow, unmistakable sound. Clay drainage tile. Original, century-old clay tile drainage, the kind laid by hand, piece by piece, by farmers who had worked this land long before Elias Broughton. Intact. Still connected. Just buried under 4 years of flood silt. They spent 3 days excavating along the tile line, clearing the blockages, coaxing the old system back to life. On the 4th day, something shifted. A sound, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The water on the surface of the southeast corner began to move. Just slightly. Just a whisper of current toward the eastern edge. But it moved. Cecilia stood in the middle of the flooded field in her rubber boots and watched the water move and felt something open in her chest like a window. It took 6 more weeks for the worst areas to drain enough to walk on. The land that emerged was heavy and dark and cold, compressed, mineral-rich silt deposited over 4 years of flooding. A disaster for conventional plowing. Potentially extraordinary for restoration planting. Dr. Osei drove down from Lexington in February with 2 graduate students, both of whom stepped out of the car, looked at the newly exposed fields, and immediately began talking to each other in the excited, rapid language of people who can see something others can't yet. They spent 2 days on the property, taking soil samples, documenting the seed collection, photographing every envelope. The report came back in March. 17 of the varieties in Elias Broughton's collection were confirmed regionally unique cultivars. 4 had no known surviving counterparts in any seed library in the United States. 1, a variety of white dent corn labeled in Elias's handwriting as Harlan Ivory, 1948, was believed to be extinct. Dr. Osei described it, in an email whose restrained academic language could not quite contain her excitement. As one of the most significant Appalachian agricultural heritage discoveries in the past 2 decades. The university offered Cecilia a partnership arrangement, technical assistance, volunteer labor, and a small grant for property remediation, in exchange for the opportunity to document, study, and replicate the collection through the university's seed preservation program. Cecilia accepted. She kept originals of every variety. Every single one. Spring arrived in Harlan County with the particular generosity of a season that follows a long, hard winter, tentative at first, then suddenly, overwhelmingly present. The fields that had been underwater were now dark and soft and breathing. Cecilia and Marcus, along with 6 university volunteers who came on rotating weekends, planted the northwest quadrant of the property in early April. Not Elias's seeds. Not yet. First they planted a cover crop, crimson clover and winter rye, to stabilize the soil, feed the microbial life, prepare the land for what would come next. Cecilia had learned this from the books, from Dr. Osei's students, from Marcus, who had grown up watching his grandmother tend a kitchen garden and knew things about soil that he'd never thought of as knowledge until someone asked. He started asking questions. Real questions, about soil pH, about composting, about the difference between open-pollinated and hybrid seed. Cecilia answered what she knew and looked up what she didn't, and somewhere in that exchange, the dynamic between them shifted from employer and employee to something closer to apprenticeship. Mutual apprenticeship, really. She was learning from him too, about the physical language of land, about patience, about when to push and when to wait. He enrolled in an agricultural science course at the community college in Harlan that fall. The tobacco barn, Elias's barn, was repaired through a combination of volunteer labor organized by the university's agricultural heritage program and a small preservation grant from the state historical society, which had become interested in the property's significance. The collapsed machine shed was cleared. The ridge of higher ground was shaped into a proper raised planting area. Cecilia moved out of the rented room above the hardware store and into a second-hand trailer placed on the high ground of the property. It was small, smaller than any place she'd lived since college, and she loved it with an intensity that surprised her. The view from her small window in the morning, looking east across the recovering fields toward the creek, was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. She kept the seed packets in the barn, reorganized and cataloged, temperature-controlled with a small system the university helped install. She kept Elias's original labels. She kept his handwriting. She did not sell the land. Several people offered. The university's interest had attracted attention, and attention in rural Kentucky tends to travel quickly. A heritage food company offered to lease the property for production. A documentary filmmaker reached out twice. An agricultural investment group sent a formal letter. She wrote back to each of them politely. She was not interested in leasing. She was not ready for a documentary. She would not be selling. What she wanted, what she had come to understand she wanted, slowly, across the months of difficult and patient work, was not a transaction. It was not fame or profit or even recognition, exactly. It was something harder to name. She wanted to continue. She planted the first of Elias's seeds in June, the Harlan ivory corn, in a test plot in the northwest corner, 20 seeds into carefully prepared mounds. Watched over with the concentrated attention she used to give her students during exams. The germination rate was 60%, remarkable for seeds of that age. 12 plants emerged, pale and tentative in the early summer soil. She sat at the edge of that test plot every evening with a cup of coffee and watched them grow. She thought about Robert, who would have been fascinated by all of this. Who would have been out here with her every weekend, taking notes in the small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Who would have driven Dr. Osei's students crazy with questions. She talked to him sometimes, there at the edge of the test plot. Not in a disturbed way, not in a way that worried her. In the way you talk to someone you loved and lost and will never stop loving. In the way that keeps a person real. "We're bringing something back," she told him, one evening in July when the corn was knee-high and the fireflies were beginning in the field. "I don't know what it means yet. But we're bringing it back." It was Marcus who found it. In October, preparing the tobacco barn for winter storage, he was clearing a section of the loft, a space they hadn't fully explored. Accessible only by a ladder and requiring you to squeeze through a low door that had swollen in its frame over the years. He came down the ladder carrying something wrapped in old newspaper and set it on the work table with a careful, slightly odd expression. "Found this up there," he said. Tucked in behind the eave. It was a journal. Elias Broughton's journal. Or rather, the last of several. The cover read Volume 7, 1995 to 2018 in the same careful pencil hand as the seed labels. Cecilia read it over the course of 2 evenings, sitting at the work table in the barn with a lamp and a blanket around her shoulders. Elias had known what he had. He'd known the collection was significant. He'd spent 20 years attempting to donate it, to universities, to seed banks, to agricultural organizations. The letters he'd written, recorded in the journal with notes on their responses, told a quiet, devastating story of institutional indifference. Too remote. Too small a collection. Not enough resources to process. He had been trying to give it away for 2 decades and no one had come. The last entry in the journal was dated March 2018, 4 months before his death, in handwriting that had grown shaky and uneven. "I don't know who will find this. I don't know if anyone will, or when. The land will flood again, it floods every few years and gets worse, and I don't know what will survive. I've done what I could. The seeds are as good as I can make them. The rest is not up to me. If you're reading this, you found them. I hope you know what to do. I think you probably do, or you wouldn't have come. Plant them. Save some. Give some away. That's the whole instruction. That's all any of this has ever been." Cecilia sat with the journal in her lap for a long time. He had known it might be too late. He had done everything anyway. There is a particular kind of courage that exists without an audience, the courage of people who do the right and necessary thing in full knowledge that they may never see the result. May receive no credit, may be long dead before anyone understands what they were doing. It is the quietest and perhaps the rarest kind of courage. Elias Broughton had kept 63 acres of seeds alive for 50 years and died with no certainty that any of it would survive him. And here Cecilia sat, in his barn, with 12 living stalks of Harlan ivory corn in the field outside and 30 more seed varieties safely catalogued and beginning their journey back into the world. She thought about the $1 she had paid for this land. The single, almost joke of $1 for something everyone else had written off as worthless, drowned, finished. She thought about how the most important things, the things that carry the real history of a place, the accumulated care of generations. The careful patient work of someone who believed in the future without any proof it would arrive. She thought about how those things have a way of becoming invisible right before they disappear. How the world moves so fast past what is quiet and submerged and still. How it takes someone willing to put on rubber boots and wade in. She thought about her seed bag. The one she'd packed without thinking. The one she'd carried from Lexington like a reflex, like a prayer. She thought about Robert in the garden on weekends, on his knees in the soil, his hands dark with earth, alive in the way he only was when he was growing something. She understood, sitting in Elias's barn, why she had driven south and east without a destination. Why she had stopped at the water's edge and recognized something she had never seen before. Why she had handed over $1 for 63 acres of nothing. She had been looking for a reason to begin. And beginning, real beginning, the kind that costs you something, always looks, from the outside, like an act of madness. Like a woman buying a flooded field for $1. Like an old farmer writing in a journal he knows may never be read. Like someone planting seeds in soil that is underwater, on the faith that water, eventually, recedes. The following spring, Cecilia Marsh hosted what she called, with deliberate, slightly stubborn modesty, a seed swap. It was not grand. It was held in the tobacco barn on a Saturday in late April, announced by a notice on the county clerk's office bulletin board and a few posts on a local community Facebook group. 17 people came. Farmers, mostly, from Harlan and surrounding counties. Some curious. Some skeptical. One man, in his 60s, who had driven nearly an hour and stood in the doorway of the barn for several minutes before coming in, looking at the labeled seed packets laid out on the work table with an expression Cecilia recognized. Like recognizing a language you thought you'd forgotten. She gave each person who came a small envelope of seeds from the collection, not the rarest, not the Harlan ivory, not yet. Not until there were enough generations of seed to share generously, but good, viable, heritage seeds. Varieties that had been grown in these hills and hollows for generations before commodity agriculture swept most of them away. Varieties with flavor and resilience and history embedded in their genetics. She asked only one thing in return, that they save seed from whatever they grew and bring some back next year. 23 people came the second year. Marcus graduated from his agricultural program the following December and was hired as an assistant at the county extension office, where, it should be noted, he has since completely changed the tone of conversations about non-viable land remediation. Dr. Osei published a paper on the Broughton collection in an agricultural heritage journal. The Harlan ivory corn was grown to a sufficient stock to be formally added to the National Seed Library. Elias's name is on the documentation. Cecilia still lives in the trailer on the ridge. She still walks her fields every morning. Her knees still hurt, but less than they did. The physical work has strengthened her in ways she didn't expect, in the same way that grief, when you walk through it instead of around it, can leave you more solid than you were before. She planted a small section of the garden near the barn with seeds from her original canvas bag, Robert's tomatoes, his pole beans, the Ohio sweet corn from the seed library. It felt right to have them growing in the same soil as Elias's collection. Like introducing old friends. She keeps his journal on the work table in the barn, inside a protective sleeve Dr. Osei sent. Sometimes, when she's working, she takes it out and reads the last entry again. Plant them. Save some. Give some away. There is a tendency, when we hear stories like this one, to focus on the discovery, the treasure in the barn, the lost seeds, the academic vindication. To treat it as a story about finding something valuable in a place no one expected. But that is not really what this story is about. This story is about a woman who had lost everything that organized her life, her husband, her home, her sense of direction, and who, instead of being still in her grief, went looking for somewhere to begin again. Who asked for nothing more than $1 worth of possibility and was willing to wade in. This story is about an old farmer who kept faith with the future even when the future gave him no reason to believe it was listening. This story is about seeds, which are, at their most fundamental, an act of belief. You put something in the ground and you trust, with no guarantee, that it will come back. You do this knowing that you may not be the one who harvests it. You do this anyway. The land that no one wanted produced, in the spring of its third year of restoration, its first real harvest, not large, not commercial, not anything you could call a business. A garden's worth of heirloom vegetables, grown in soil that 4 years of flooding had made, paradoxically, extraordinarily fertile. Deeply mineralized. Teeming with the kind of microbial life that only emerges after disruption and recovery. It was not what the land used to be. It was better.